Good morning, everybody. It's really, really good to be here. Sometime in November, Leslie wrote and said, we've got a need for December 10th. I need a quick answer. And so my mind was going through, oh my gosh, I've got a broken arm. I can't write. I can't brush my hair. I can't drive very well. And my other hand had already written, yes, I want to do it. Because as this year comes to an end, this community has been so much on my mind and heart. And the tremendous year that we journeyed through together last year. And especially at this time of year, remembering the ones we said goodbye to. Some after long, well-lived lives, and some far too soon. And I'm especially thinking of our dear indigo man, Rich Moore, and feeling that right now as we approach the first anniversary of his loss. And so it felt so right and like such a gift to be here with you all today. It felt like coming full circle. And today is International Human Rights Day. And today marks the launching of a one-year-long UN campaign called Stand Up for Human Rights. And this campaign urges us to take action in our own daily lives to stand up for the rights that protect us all and to promote the kinship of all human beings. And I didn't know that before I had already made the title. So that was a nice gift. And this campaign reminds us of the words of Eleanor Roosevelt, who says, we must take a stand for human rights in small places close to home, so close and so small that they can't be seen on the maps of the world. Because unless these rights have meaning there, they have little meaning anywhere. And about this time last year, we were just reeling from the results of the presidential election in this country. If you remember, it really has only been 1 year. And we were bracing against our most dystopian fears, many of which have been surpassed already, and we are still standing. And at that time, I shared a dream that had come. And the energy of that dream has been with me all year. And so I brought it with me again this morning because it seemed to want to be part of this circle too. So here it is again. I'm in a field, a wild meadow, and I see a black mare who's down on the ground and she's struggling to stand, to rise from a pile of ashes from an ordeal. She has soot and ash on her flanks and legs. And I'm talking to her. I put my hand on her. And I say, careful girl, easy does it. And suddenly up she goes and she stands tall. And I step back and I see this is no regular horse. She's at least 3 stories high. And I stand in the presence of this enormous dark horse. And I shared that near the end of his life, Carl Jung had written about a series of mythic dreams that he had documented. And he said that these dreams were about an ailing king and a system that is dying and an enormous black mare who breaks free, cuts loose. And he concluded that this black mare represents feminine wisdom suppressed in the culture at large, but rising from the collective unconscious, pointing to the death of patriarchal forms of leadership and the reemergence of a long-buried feminine principle capable of leading future generations towards a more balanced existence. That's Carl Jung, and that was the dream last year that has walked with me all year. Recently, I was part of a conversation that included social justice activists and advocates from throughout the Americas, from north to south. We were doing a shared analysis, and this analysis was deep, clear, and disturbing. And a feisty, elderly nun from Argentina who works in the slums of Argentina summed it up. And she said, right now in the Americas, we are under siege. We are being occupied by corporations and military forces that are coming to take water, minerals, gas, fossil fuels, forests, lands. They are damming, mining, fracking, destroying every last living thing. This is an invasion, a new conquest, and it may be worse than the first one. So with that, I decided I needed to check in with Oracle poet and guide Alice Walker, which I do on a regular basis because she always finds a way past twisted monsters. And I was so excited to find that she had a new poem that she had just written from her home, where she lives on the edges of the fires that raged in Northern California, not these, the other ones. And so I jumped into this poem, and the last line hit hard. She writes, "Perhaps we are facing our last turn around the cosmic wheel. Flood, wind, cold, earthquake, fascism, polar shift, fire, realization. We may have come this time to say goodbye." And my heart sunk. I said, this from Alice Walker, who knows and sees and leads us through so many troubles. And I know her words are true. And I know that the dream of that enormous dark horse who rises from the ordeal is also true. We do live in dangerous times that require a paradigm shift of enormous proportions. The clock is ticking. It is already too late for so many people and places and living things. And so how do we support the emergence of this energy and these values that can lead us toward a more balanced existence on which everything depends? This is the question I was wrestling with in preparation for this morning. And for me, I find part of the answer in the work of Dr. Clarissa Pecola Estes, a Jungian psychologist, a storyteller, a trauma specialist who grew up in Michigan along this water. And she says that we need to become more dangerous, but not in the way we use the word today that infers threat or harm. She speaks of an older, more ancient root of the word. She says, the word danger in its oldest form meant to protect, to say, you stand in my danger, in the aura surrounding me, funded by my heart, soul, and spirit, that says certain things of this earth are so precious that they can never be allowed to be harmed or made to vanish. You stand in my danger. So notice that in this understanding, this ancient understanding of dangerous and protection, protection has nothing to do with weapons or with killing anything. It does not say you stand in the array of my guns and my assault rifles, or my armies, or my missiles, or my nuclear arsenals that surround me. This ancient understanding says that protection comes from the energy, the aura surrounding me, funded by my heart, my soul, and my spirit. And that this energy is protective, it is generative, and it leads to compassionate, empowered action. It says, you stand in my danger because I will protect and help and create. I will defend, I will unleash, I will hold back, I will restrain, I will open up, I will warn, I will carve doors and walls and do whatever it takes. You stand in my danger. And at a time when it is acceptable public discourse to propose that if everyone in that church or dance floor or shopping mall or school or hospital or airport, or you name it, had a gun, that everyone would be protected, at a time when ailing kings play roulette with threats of war and nuclear strike, it's important to reclaim this ancient meaning of danger, a danger that truly protects, And Dr. Estes talks about three aspects of this type of protective danger. First, it's rooted in what is wild. And I know you all are talking about wild, so we're on the right path. And Dr. Estes says, in its original sense, to be wild means to live a natural life with innate integrity, healthy boundaries, and intact instincts. She says, to be wild is to stand in the sureness of strong soul footing. That's wild. Second, protective danger is wise. And for Dr. Estes, wisdom comes from experience. It comes from learning to live, to pass through fire and through the blazes of joy, through the smoke and grime of real life. It comes from suffering and from creative works. All of these increase the ability to see, and this makes wisdom. Third, protective danger is generative. And Dr. Estes reminds us that generativity comes from the edges, not from the center or the top of dominant culture. Creativity, original intuition, insight, vibrancy, visionary spark live at the edges and on the margins. Michael Meade is a mythologist and a scholar who works with young men at risk on the margins. And he speaks of an Irish folk myth that inspires him. He says that this myth teaches that when the center cannot hold, it does not disappear. It fragments and it goes into the margins. And in our time, each of us must go to the margin that both attracts and makes us most afraid. And we need only find a single thread and pull it back to the center. And in this incremental way, the center is rewoven. So I want to share a story about a time when I experienced the power of standing in someone's wild, wise, and generative danger. We were in Central America, and Tom and I were working with the Quakers. We were the regional representatives at the time. And this was a time after the wars. It was a time of regressive policies that were being imposed from Washington and the financial institutions. It was a time of scandals and corruption and long buried traumas and betrayals and the unmasking of sexual abuse. It was a time of reckoning. It was a time of shadow. And every month we would come together at the university and do our contextual analysis, which I talked about in terms of liberation theology. That's always the starting point. Where are we? What's happening? And then we reflect, and then we find our empowered action. So we were doing our analysis month after month, sometimes 100 people from different parts of the country, all different walks of life. And after listening to this mess month after month after month, at the end of the year, the woman who facilitated these sessions for the university, who's a very articulate writer and a very skilled at synthesizing complex material, summed it up in a way that I will never forget. She said, "Our reality is this. Por donde toca, sale pus. Wherever we touch, pus comes out." Alberto, I'll give you the rest of it later. Where is he? I'll tell him the rest of it later. There was a sickness in the body politic, and it was all coming out. And that time was a lot like this time. And at that time, the US was pushing its free trade agreements on the region, and there was a round of negotiations, so all the negotiators were coming, and they were in Managua. And this was being held at the Intercontinental Hotel right downtown. And busloads of people were coming in from the countryside to protest because they knew what this was going to mean for their land and livelihood. So we were going to the protest, and we were going with our friend Tania Vilma. was a community organizer and a natural leader, all of about this high. And during the war, she was very active in the overthrow of the dictator. And then during the revolution, she was a key part of what became the community policing model. So she's sort of a link that lets the police know what's happening and what needs attention in the community. And at the same time, she keeps an eye on the police officers and reports when they're getting out of line. So you do not mess with Tania Vilma. And she has quite the aura surrounding her. So we get to the plaza in front of the hotel, which is this giant pyramid, all glass windows in front. So the negotiators could see out. And the Nicaraguans really know how to protest, so it was quite a scene. And we could see that the riot police had been deployed on the edges of the plaza. And people hadn't seen this since the time of the dictator. So it was a really heavy moment. Felt like a moment of regression. And then word came that they were going to move in and clear everyone out of the plaza. So I turned to Tania Vilma to ask what she wanted to do. And I see her heading straight towards a line of riot police. And I hear her yelling, "Who's your jefe? Who's in charge?" And then I see her plant herself in front of one of these officers. And she's holding this little purse in front of her. And she's motioning for him to put his visor up. And then she's putting her hand on his shield and she's pushing it down to the ground. And by the time I catch up with her, she's leaning over and I hear her say, "Hijo, son, what do you think you're doing? You are one of us. We put you in that position to serve and protect us, never to repress us. We are not your enemy. The ones in that building selling away our future land, water, and livelihoods. That's who you should be clearing out of this plaza." And then she continued. She said, "You know, you are here thanks to generations of struggle. When William Walker came from the United States and declared himself president and reinstated slavery here, we stood up. And when the Marines occupied us for 30 years, we stood up. And when they put their dictator in power to repress us for decades, we stood up, and we are never going to stop standing up. And we will never stop defending our rights." And by now, others around him all had their visors up and their shields were down, and they were leaning in to see what in the world was going on with this woman. And the officer lowered his head, and I heard him say, "Sí, madre." Yes, mother. Not in a personal sense. In Nicaragua, this is a term of greatest respect for all that is wild, wise, and generative, for the values long repressed by domination and patriarchy, and that are capable of leading us to a more balanced future. And something huge shifted in that plaza, and that line of riot police fell apart. And in standing up and giving them back their historic memory from the margins, she pulled things back to center. And we stood and we watched as row after row of campesinos from the mountains plowed past into that plaza. And I stood so proud to stand in the danger of that enormous woman. And this year, in this country, we stand in the danger of wave after wave of women, and some men who are standing up and telling the truth about the magnitude and systemic sickness of misogyny, sexual abuse, assault, and harassment in our culture. And they're bringing down titans from major news networks, from Hollywood to Disney to NPR, from the Olympics to Capitol Hill, breaking the silence about abuse of power on the part of police officers, professors, journalists, doctors, elected representatives, and presidents. And Tarana Burke, who works on the margins and who founded Me Too 10 years ago, reminds us that for every big name, there is also the owner of the grocery store, the coach, teacher, clergy, neighbor, one close to home. This is pervasive. Writer and historian and activist Rebecca Solnit reminds us that this is a human rights issue. Sexual assault is an act of silencing, of saying your bodily sovereignty and your human rights, your jurisdiction of your own body, your right to consent or not consent are meaningless to me. You have no value to me as a human being. And in an unprecedented way in our lifetimes, we see this tidal wave of women publicly and collectively cutting loose, rising from an ordeal, standing up, speaking out, having each other's back, saying, "Me too, I believe you." Shifting a paradigm from one of abuse and entrenched impunity to one in which the twisted monster of patriarchy and power over is put on notice that yes, there is a political cost, there are consequences, and we are just getting going best. We are taking this towards a more balanced existence. Because as Alice Walker tells us, there is no future for our daughters or our sons if we do not insist on and forge our solidarity by standing up and speaking out. And we stand in the danger of the unofficial delegation of the United States to the climate talks in Germany, in defiance of Trump's withdrawal from the Paris Agreement. These mayors and governors and senators and policymakers, representatives of business and civil society, universities, and activists from the United States joined every other country in the entire world to say there are things of this earth that are so precious that they can never be allowed to be harmed or made to vanish. And we stand in the danger of bottom-up climate activists who are standing up for earth rights in small places close to home all over the world, blocking pipelines and dams and fracking and occupying entire forests, protecting rivers and lakes and national parks and wildlands, and mustangs and wolves and caribou and dolphins and elephants. And elephants. Because they are wild, wise, and generous and generative, these climate activists, this movement. And they tell us we are unstoppable. Another world is possible. And everything stands in their danger. And we stand in the danger of Judith Herman at Harvard Medical School, whose groundbreaking work in trauma and recovery helped so many find their voices and rise from the ordeal of war and sexual violence. She, together with a cohort of 27 mental health experts, concluded they had an ethical and professional duty to warn about the current leadership in this country and published an open letter saying, collectively, we warn that the president represents a risk to the nation and the world and should not be entrusted with the life and death powers of the presidency. And we stand in the danger of new leaders like Danica Rome, the first openly transgendered person to be elected to the state legislature in Virginia, who ran against an incumbent of 13 years who described himself as Virginia's chief homophobe. And after winning and asked about her opponent, she says, "Bob is my constituent now. I don't attack my constituents." And we stand in the danger of Mrs. Judy Scott, mother of Walter Scott, an unarmed Black man shot in the back at least 5 times by a white officer. And his mother, who with the same fierceness of heart with which she sought justice for her son so that things will change for other Black men, turned in the courtroom and gave her forgiveness to the man who killed her son and received his apology. And I can't close this circle without bringing in Berta Cáceres. You asked about her this morning. Indigenous rights activist and Goldman Environmental Prize winner, murdered in Honduras the year I came here. Her murder remains in impunity, though findings of an independent commission that were released just now in November concluded that existing proof is conclusive regarding the participation of numerous state agents and high-ranking executives of the hydroelectric company in the execution and cover-up of her murder. Her struggle, funded by so much heart, soul, and spirit, continues to inspire people around the world to stand up. And so far, the river that she gave her life for continues to run wild, and it stands in her danger. And this week, another Berta from Honduras, Berta Oliva, from the Committee of the Families of the Disappeared in Honduras, who I also have talked about here at C3, stepped into this circle in a big way from Honduras, where she warns of a second coup d'etat and the unleashing of a human rights catastrophe. On November 22nd, there were presidential elections that were marred by electoral fraud in favor of the standing president, who's backed by the United States and who is called by many a dictator. And in response, people took to the streets to stand up for their rights and to stand up for democracy, and the crackdown was swift and it was hard. A state of siege was declared, a military curfew was imposed, and security forces began to repress with live bullets. And in the midst of what Amnesty International calls a dangerous freefall in Honduras, the US Embassy congratulated the country on elections, and the State Department certified Honduras for human rights. And my friend, Jesuit priest Ismael Moreno says, the US Embassy is directly responsible for legitimizing an illegal and fraudulent process. What happens to our lives and work in defense of human rights will be the responsibility of this alliance between the US and the dictatorship that is to ensue. There will be a convulsion that no one can contain. And so I speak with Berta at night from her home under military curfew. And she says, Jenny, the city has become a place of ghosts and soldiers and sirens. And then she says, listen. And she holds the phone up in her home in Tegucigalpa. And I'm hearing in Fenville, Michigan, the banging of metal and clanging pots and pans and singing and shouting. And people from barrios throughout the city, across the country, are defying the curfew from their homes and their doorsteps, the only place left to stand up for rights under martial law. And they're using it. And they shout, the dictator must go. And in the morning, women and children are seen taking white flowers out to the soldiers in the streets. And they say, hijo, son, what do you think you're doing? And in a dizzying turn of events, the police and special forces units, Cobras and Tigres, announced a strike of brazos caídos, fallen arms. They said, we're not going to follow orders to repress our people anymore because we are the people. And Dr. Juan Almendares with the Center of the Treatment for Torture Survivors in Honduras writes, remember, the real struggle for human rights is not just about individual civil and political rights, but it is about the turning over of policies that promote colonialism and imperialism today. And human rights defender and journalist Dina Mesa from Honduras, speaking to the Nobel Women's Initiative, says, everything changes. No evil lasts forever. Do not despair. Hold on to hope. Hold on to your motivation to change the system. Those who are harming the world are fewer than those of us who are fighting to transform it. Remember and focus on that. And then out of the blue, for no reason, my friend Tupac calls, who always stands rooted in his indigenous spirituality and reverence for this wild, wise, and generative earth. And he says, the solutions are already here. Mother Earth is gathering herself and she will rise from this ordeal. We don't know what will happen, but we can lend our weight wherever we are, however we can, lean in and support her as she takes her stand and brings things back into balance, and thank her for carrying us on her back, and set our intention to make it through this storm with her and with all of our relations. And in these extraordinary times, I find myself walking in that wild meadow behind my house and standing in the danger of that enormous dark horse of a dream that carries the power we need to shift paradigms, to take a stand. And this is my practice in these times. So I just want to invite you, it'll just be a moment, but to join me in a standing meditation for extraordinary times. So please stand if you are able. If not, you can take a stand by sitting down or on one knee. That is also a powerful way to take a stand. And just take a moment to look around this room at the faces of this community with which you stand. And feel the connection to the wild earth beneath our feet that supports, sustains, gives life, and carries us on our back. Stand in the sureness of your soul footing and come into your center. Feel the power of the energy surrounding you, funded by heart, soul, and spirit, that stands in a community that says certain values are so precious to the soul that they can never be allowed to be harmed or to made vanish. Well-being, open inquiry, common humanity, diversity, compassionate action, environmental sustainability. May these values stand in your danger. May they take us where we want to go. And in closing, these words from Dr. Estes. A prayer. Refuse to fall down. And if you cannot refuse to fall down, refuse to stay down. And if you cannot refuse to stay down, lift your heart toward heaven and to this wild earth. Ask that it be filled. It is in the middle of misery that so much becomes clear. The one who says, nothing good came of this, is not yet listening. Because sometimes, from sorrow, for no reason, a sound comes, a reminder that a steady center is holding all else. And it helps us to stand up, to slide past trouble and twisted monsters, so we can get going our best, learning how real it is here on earth again and again and again.